Don't touch me. The billionaire snapped, his voice cutting clean through the soft jazz and clinking glasses as the entire restaurant seemed to freeze in place. But Ava Johnson didn't move back, her worn sneakers planted against the polished floor as she looked at the deep red stain spreading across his crisp white sleeve, her breath steady even as the manager's eyes burned into her from across the room, silently warning her to stay out of it. Because people like her didn't step into moments like this, not when the man in front of her was Daniel Whitmore, the kind of man whose name alone could silence a room, the kind of man who never needed help and never accepted it. But still, she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, like crossing a line she knew she couldn't uncross, and pressed a folded linen napkin gently against his wrist, her fingers careful, precise, not trembling, not apologizing, just doing what needed to be done. And for a second, just one, his eyes met hers, sharp and unreadable, like he was trying to figure out who she thought she was, a waitress in a faded uniform with a name tag that had been scratched one too many times, someone who had spent the last 8 hours carrying trays and smiling at people who barely looked at her. And yet here she was, touching him without permission, interrupting a world that wasn't supposed to include her. "You should let me take a look," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. And that's when the manager rushed in, breath tight, face stiff with forced politeness. "Ava, step away right now." But Ava didn't. Not immediately, because something about the way his hands stiffened under the cloth didn't feel right. Not like a simple accident, not like something you ignore and move on from. And the air between them shifted, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm breaks, and Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice dropping just enough to carry weight without volume. "I said, don't touch me." But there was hesitation now, a flicker, something small and almost invisible, and Ava saw it, the way she noticed things most people didn't, the way she always had, and instead of pulling away, she adjusted the cloth slightly, pressing just enough to slow the spread, her eyes focused, her movements calm, like she'd done this before even if no one here would believe it. And around them, the silence grew heavier, waiters frozen mid-step, guests pretending not to stare, the music suddenly too loud and too distant at the same time, until finally the manager's hand grabbed her arm, sharper now, no longer pretending. "You're done here," he whispered through clenched teeth, and that's when Ava let go, not because she was afraid, but because she had already done what mattered. And as she stepped back, the napkin still pressed against his wrist, Daniel Whitmore didn't look at the manager, didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her, just for a second longer than necessary, like something didn't add up, like the world had shifted by half an inch, and he hadn't decided yet if he liked it. And then it was over. The noise came back. The room breathed again, and Ava turned away, already feeling the weight of what it would cost her, not knowing that in less than 24 hours, that one moment would be the only thing standing between him and something far worse than a stain on his sleeve. "You are fired," the manager said, not loud, not dramatic, just final, like a door closing somewhere Ava could not see. And she nodded once, because arguing never changed outcomes in places like this. Not when you wore a name tag and someone else wore a tailored suit. So she untied her apron slowly, fingers brushing over the thin fabric as if memorizing the last thing that had kept her afloat, and placed it on the counter without a word, the scent of lemon cleaner and grilled steak hanging in the air heavier than before, while behind her the restaurant resumed its rhythm, glasses clinking, low laughter returning, like nothing had happened at all, except something had, and she could feel it in the tightness of her chest as she stepped through the back door into the narrow alley, the cool night air hitting her face like a quiet reset, her phone vibrating in her pocket with a message she already knew would not be good, the hospital reminding her that the balance was past due, numbers she had memorized by heart even though she wished she could forget them. And for a moment she leaned against the brick wall, eyes closed, breathing in, breathing out, steady, controlled, the way she had taught herself to stay calm when everything else felt like it was slipping, because panic never paid bills, and it definitely did not fix what was already broken. So she straightened, pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and started walking, her steps light but purposeful, like she was trying to outrun the weight of what she had just lost. While back inside, Daniel Whitmore sat at the corner table, the linen napkin now replaced by a clean bandage someone else had applied, too tight, too careless, and he noticed it immediately. The difference in pressure, the lack of precision, small details that most people ignored, but he never did. His eyes drifting for a fraction of a second toward the door she had disappeared through, then back to the glass in front of him, untouched, something about the entire situation refusing to settle into something simple. Because it should have been simple, a minor incident, an overstepping employee, a resolved inconvenience. But it was not. Not the way her voice had sounded, not the way her hands had moved without hesitation, and not the way she had looked at him, not impressed, not intimidated, just focused, like he was a problem to solve instead of a man to please. And that unsettled him more than the stain ever could. "Sir, your car is ready," his assistant said quietly, but Daniel did not stand right away, his fingers tapping once against the table, slow, deliberate, as if he was replaying something he could not quite explain, until finally he rose, adjusting his cuff with a small frown, the fabric slightly stiff where the stain had been, and as he walked toward the exit, something shifted again, subtle but sharp, a faint warmth spreading under the bandage. Not pain, not exactly, but not right either, and for the first time that night. He paused, just for a second, his jaw tightening as his mind ran through possibilities he did not like, because he trusted control, and control meant understanding, and right now, he did not understand why a waitress who had nothing to gain would risk everything to step into his world, and why. Out of everyone in that room, she had been the only one who saw something he had not. Something is wrong, Daniel said quietly, not to his assistant, not to anyone in particular, just into the space of the car as the city lights slid across the tinted windows in long streaks of gold and white, his voice low but certain, the kind of certainty that came from years of trusting his instincts when numbers did not add up, and right now nothing added up, not the warmth under the bandage, not the faint tightening in his wrist that should have eased by now instead of lingering like a question, and definitely not the memory of a waitress who had acted with more precision than the staff he paid 6 figures to maintain. "Should I call a doctor, sir?" his assistant asked, already reaching for his phone, but Daniel shook his head once, slow, controlled, because he did not react without understanding, and reacting too soon meant losing control, something he had built his entire life around never doing. But even as he leaned back against the leather seat, his eyes closing for a brief second, the image returned again, her hands steady, her voice calm, her refusal to step back even when she had everything to lose. And that was what unsettled him the most, not the physical discomfort, but the fact that she had not hesitated. People hesitated around him all the time. They measured their words, their actions, their presence. But she had not. She had moved like the outcome mattered more than the consequences. And that kind of decision usually came from experience, not guesswork. "Pull over," he said suddenly, his eyes opening as the car slowed along the curb, his assistant turning, confused but silent, because questions were not part of his job, and Daniel flexed his fingers slightly under the bandage, feeling the subtle resistance, the quiet warning his body was giving him, and for the first time that night, he allowed the possibility to settle in fully. What if she had not just been helping? What if she had been recognizing something he had missed, and that thought landed heavier than anything else, because missing things was not something he allowed himself to do, not in business, not in life, and certainly not with his own safety. "Get me the number for the lab," he said, his tone sharper now, more focused, the shift immediate and unmistakable, because once a question formed in his mind, it did not stay a question for long. It became a problem to solve, and problems were what he understood best. And as his assistant scrambled to make the call, Daniel reached for the edge of the bandage, adjusting it slightly, testing the pressure the way she had done, replicating the exact movement he had watched without realizing he was memorizing it. And there it was again, that same precise relief, small but undeniable, and his jaw tightened, not in frustration, but in recognition. Because that was not luck, that was knowledge, and knowledge came from somewhere, from training, from experience, from a past that did not match the uniform she had been wearing, and outside. The city moved on, cars passing, people walking, unaware that inside a parked black sedan, a single moment in a restaurant was beginning to unravel into something much larger, something that connected a waitress with nothing to gain to a billionaire who suddenly realized he might have walked away from the one person who actually knew what was happening to him. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something close. Enough to make him act faster than usual. Find her, he said quietly, the decision landing with finality, because whatever she had seen, whatever she had known, he needed answers, and he was not used to needing anyone, especially not someone the world had already decided did not matter. Find her, Daniel had said, and now the words moved faster than the car ever could, passing through calls, messages, quiet instructions that carried more weight than they sounded, until they reached the one place that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and polished wood. The restaurant already closing for the night, chairs stacked, lights dimmed, the illusion of calm settling over a space that had shifted just hours before, and the manager stood behind the counter going through receipts when the door opened again, the soft chime cutting through the silence like something out of place, his head lifting with irritation first, then confusion, then something closer to panic when he recognized who had stepped back inside. Because men like Daniel Whitmore did not return without a reason, and reasons like that were rarely small. "Sir, I did not expect you back," he said quickly, voice tight, hands already smoothing over nothing, trying to control a moment that was not his to control anymore. And Daniel did not respond right away, his gaze moving slowly across the room, not searching for people, but for details, for traces, for something that still carried her presence even after she had been pushed out of it. The faint mark on the counter where she had rested her tray, the small indentation near the service door where it never quite closed all the way, things most people ignored but he did not, because patterns mattered, and she had disrupted one. "The waitress," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but with an edge that made the manager straighten instinctively. "Where is she?" And the question was simple, but the silence that followed was not, stretching just long enough to make the manager swallow before answering. "She is no longer employed here, sir." Careful, distant, like he was trying to keep the situation contained, like saying less would somehow make this smaller. But Daniel's eyes did not leave his face, not even for a second. "That was not my question," he said. And there it was, the shift, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of tone that turned assumptions into consequences, and the manager felt it, the weight of it settling into the room like something heavy and unavoidable. "We do not keep personal information on staff accessible," he replied, choosing his words carefully, but his voice betrayed him just enough, because he knew, and Daniel knew that he knew, and for a moment neither of them moved, the air thick with something unspoken, until Daniel reached into his pocket, not for money, not for leverage in the obvious sense, but for his phone. Placing it slowly on the counter, screen lighting up with a name the manager recognized instantly, someone higher, someone whose voice could change things faster than policies ever could, and he did not press anything, did not make the call, just let the possibility exist between them, quiet and powerful. And that was enough. It always was, because control was not about force, it was about understanding where pressure mattered most. And the manager exhaled, the decision already made before he spoke. "Ava Johnson," he said, the name landing in the silence like something that should not have mattered but suddenly did. "She worked the late shift, part-time. I think she lives somewhere on the east side." And Daniel nodded once, slow, absorbing every word, every detail, not because it was much, but because it was something, and something was all he needed to start. "Think," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not needing to. And the manager's eyes flickered, searching his own memory. Now, like it might save him from the tension pressing in on all sides. "She mentioned a hospital once," he added quickly. "I think her mother is sick." And that was it, a small detail, almost insignificant in any other context. But here it shifted everything. Because now it was not just about a waitress who had stepped out of line. It was about someone who had something to lose and still chose to act anyway. And Daniel picked up his phone, the movement precise, deliberate, his mind already connecting pieces that had not existed hours ago. And as he turned toward the door, the quiet of the restaurant closing behind him, the city outside felt different, sharper somehow, like it was holding something just out of reach. And for the first time, finding her was not just about answers. It was about understanding why someone with so little would risk everything for someone like him, and why that moment refused to let him walk away from it. The hospital smelled like antiseptic, and Overworked air conditioning, the kind that hummed softly but never quite cooled the tension in the room, and Ava Johnson sat in a plastic chair that had molded itself to too many waiting bodies before hers, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 30 minutes ago, but she had not noticed. Her eyes fixed on the hallway where nurses moved in steady patterns, efficient, distant, focused on people who mattered more in that moment. Because that was how places like this worked. Priorities measured in urgency, not fairness, and she understood that better than most, her phone resting face down on her lap. Silent now after too many reminders she could not answer, numbers she could not pay, realities she could not ignore, and still she sat there, back straight, breathing even, because breaking down would not change anything, and control, even the smallest amount, was something she refused to lose. While a few floors away, Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the elevator into a space that felt nothing like the environments he was used to controlling, the lighting too harsh, the walls too plain, the air too honest, and he paused for half a second, just enough to take it in before continuing forward, his assistant trailing slightly behind, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. Because this was not a boardroom, not a negotiation, not a place where power translated the same way, and Daniel knew it, which was why his pace slowed, just slightly, his eyes moving across faces, people waiting, people hoping, people who did not care who he was or what he owned, and that alone shifted something in him, subtle but real, until he saw her, not immediately, not like in the movies, where everything aligns perfectly, but gradually, his attention catching on the stillness of someone who was not moving like the others, not pacing, not scrolling, just sitting, focused, contained, like she was holding something together with nothing but will, and he stopped, not close enough to interrupt, not yet, just watching for a second longer than necessary, confirming what he already knew without understanding why it mattered. And Ava felt it before she saw him, the shift in the space. Around her, the quiet weight of someone standing too still, too deliberate. And when she looked up, her expression did not change the way most people's did when they recognized him. There was no surprise, no sudden adjustment, just a brief pause, a flicker of recognition, and then calm, like she had already decided how much of this moment she would allow to affect her. And Daniel noticed that too, the absence of reaction, the lack of performance, and it made him step closer, closing the distance with the same precision he applied to everything else. "You left before I could thank you," he said, his voice lower here, not softened, just different, like the room demanded it, and Ava studied him for a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup before relaxing again. "I did not do it for thanks," she replied. Simple, direct, no edge, no apology, just truth. And the words landed heavier than expected, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily she said them, like it had never been a question, and Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, not arguing, because arguing required a different kind of leverage, and he was starting to understand that whatever had driven her actions was not something he could influence with money or status. "You said something was wrong," he continued, shifting the conversation back to what mattered, because answers were still the priority, and Ava's gaze dropped briefly to his wrist, then back to his eyes, her expression sharpening just enough to show that she had not forgotten. "I said it did not look like a simple cut," she corrected quietly, and there it was again. The precision, the refusal to exaggerate or retreat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the hospital filling the space between them, distant voices, rolling carts, quiet announcements overhead, until Daniel exhaled slowly, the decision forming as clearly as any contract he had ever signed. "Then tell me what you saw," he said, and Ava hesitated, not out of fear, but out of calculation, because speaking now would change things, not just for him, but for her too, and she knew it, the cost, the risk, the line she would be crossing again, and as she looked at him, really looked this time, she realized something that shifted the weight of the moment entirely. He was not asking because he wanted reassurance, he was asking because he needed the truth. And people like him were not used to needing anything from people like her, because it was not just the bleeding. Ava said quietly, her voice steady but lower now, like she was choosing each word with care, not to impress him, not to protect herself, but because the truth required precision, and she was not someone who guessed when it came to things like this. And Daniel did not interrupt, did not rush her, his posture still, his attention fixed in a way that made the noise of the hospital seem distant, irrelevant, like everything outside this conversation had been muted. Your skin tone around the cut, she continued, her eyes flicking briefly to his wrist again. It was off, not pale from blood loss, not flushed from pressure, something in between, and your pulse was uneven, not fast like stress, not slow like shock, just inconsistent. She paused, just long enough to let it settle, because what she was about to say carried weight, and she knew it. That is usually not from a simple injury, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because even without her explanation, his body had already told him something was wrong. He had just not had the context to define it, and now he did, or at least he had a direction. You are saying it was not an accident, he said, his tone controlled, but sharper now, focused in a way that made the air between them feel narrower, more exact, and Ava held his gaze, not backing away, not softening, just meeting him where he stood. I am saying it did not look like one, she replied, and again she chose her words carefully, not making claims she could not prove, not stepping beyond what she knew. And that restraint, that discipline, made what she did say land harder, because it meant she was not exaggerating. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough for the implication to take shape, not fully formed, but present. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind already moving, already connecting, already shifting from uncertainty to strategy. Because if something had been done intentionally, then it was not just about understanding what happened, it was about understanding why. And who. And that was a different kind of problem entirely. How would you know that? He asked finally, not accusatory, not dismissive, just direct, because answers required clarity, and Ava looked down at her hands for a second, not out of hesitation, but out of memory, something older than this moment, something that had shaped the way she saw things others ignored. I started nursing school, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. I did not finish, but I learned enough to recognize when something does not match what it is supposed to be. And there it was, the missing piece, small in words but significant in meaning, because it explained everything he had noticed without understanding, her confidence, her precision, her refusal to step back. It had not been instinct alone, it had been knowledge, interrupted, unfinished, but still there, and Daniel nodded once, slow, absorbing it, recalibrating his understanding of her completely, because she was no longer just a waitress who had acted out of kindness. She was someone who had seen something others had not, someone who had chosen to act on it despite the cost, and that changed the equation entirely. You said it in front of everyone, he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful now, almost analytical, knowing it could cost you your job. And Ava's lips pressed together briefly before she answered, not defensive, not regretful, just honest. If I was right, it was not something you ignore, she said, and that was it, simple, direct, no need for explanation beyond that. And Daniel felt something shift again, not in the situation, but in his understanding of her, because people in his world calculated risk against reward, measured every action against outcome. But she had not done that. She had acted because it was the right thing to do, regardless of what it would cost her. And that was not something he encountered often, not in a world built on leverage and advantage. And for a brief moment, just a second, the question in his mind was no longer just about what had happened to him, but about why someone like her still believed that doing the right thing was enough, and why that belief had just changed everything. Daniel did not speak right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he was measuring something that could not be reduced to numbers or outcomes, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like both of them understood that whatever came next would shift the direction of everything that had already started unfolding. And Ava felt it too, the weight of his attention, the kind that did not glance or dismiss, but stayed, focused, searching for something real, and she held it without flinching, without adjusting herself to make it easier for him, because she had already crossed that line once tonight, and she was not stepping back now. If it was not an accident, Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than before, but sharper in intent, then someone wanted it to look like one, and the words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, and Ava nodded slightly, not agreeing to a theory, but acknowledging the logic of it, because she had seen enough to know that when something felt wrong, it usually was, and ignoring that feeling never made it go away. "Did you notice anything else?" he asked, and there was no pressure in the question, just precision, like he was gathering pieces of a puzzle he had not realized existed until now. And Ava took a breath, her eyes drifting for a moment as she replayed the scene in her mind. The noise, the movement, the small details that most people overlooked, but she had trained herself not to, even after walking away from the life that had once required it. "The glass," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful now. "It did not break the way it should have." And Daniel's gaze sharpened immediately, the shift subtle but unmistakable, because that was new information, something tangible, something he could work with. "What do you mean?" he asked, and Ava met his eyes again, her tone steady, grounded. An observation, not assumption. It cracked unevenly, like there was already pressure in it before it hit the floor, and the liquid did not spread evenly either. She paused, just long enough to choose her next words carefully. "I am not saying it was tampered with, but it did not behave like a normal spill." And for a moment the sounds of the hospital seemed to fade completely, replaced by the quiet click of Daniel's mind connecting the dots, each detail slotting into place with a clarity that left very little room for coincidence. And he turned slightly, his assistant stepping closer instinctively, already sensing the shift in direction. "Call the lab again," Daniel said, his tone firm now, controlled but urgent in a way that did not need volume. "Tell them I want a full analysis, not just the standard panel." And the assistant nodded quickly, stepping away to make the call, leaving the two of them in a space that felt smaller now, more focused, more real. And Ava watched him for a second, the way he moved, the way he adjusted without hesitation once he had enough information to act, and she recognized it. Not the wealth, not the status, but the discipline, the clarity of someone who did not ignore what mattered once they saw it. And for the first time since this had started, she allowed herself to feel something other than control, something quieter, less defined, because whatever had happened in that restaurant was no longer contained to a single moment. It was unfolding, expanding into something neither of them had expected. "You should get it checked again," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "Even if it turns out to be nothing." And Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not at the uniform she had worn, not at the position she had been in, but at the person in front of him, the one who had stepped into a situation she could have ignored and chosen not to. And he nodded once, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement, because he understood now that whatever answers he was about to find, they had started with her. And as the assistant returned with a quiet confirmation, the next steps already in motion, Daniel realized something he had not expected to realize tonight, that this was no longer just about solving a problem. It was about understanding the moment that had revealed it, and the person who had seen it before anyone else did. The call came faster than expected, a quiet vibration against the assistant's phone that cut through the steady rhythm of the hospital. And when he answered, his posture shifted almost instantly, shoulders tightening, voice lowering, because whatever was being said on the other end was not routine, not standard, not something you brushed off and moved on from. And Daniel did not need to hear the words to understand the weight of them. He saw it in the way the assistant's eyes flicked toward him, then away, then back again, like he was deciding how to say something that could not be unsaid. And that was enough. That was all it took for the air around them to change again, subtle but undeniable. "Sir," the assistant said finally, stepping closer, his voice controlled but no longer neutral. The preliminary analysis came back, and he paused, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that carried meaning before the words even arrived. There were foreign compounds detected in the liquid, and silence followed, not loud, not dramatic, just complete, like the space itself had decided to hold that moment in place. And Ava felt it settle in her chest, not as surprise, but as confirmation, the quiet kind that does not need validation because it already exists. And Daniel stood completely still, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something beneath it sharpened, something focused, something that had just crossed from possibility into reality. "What kind of compounds?" he asked, his voice even, precise, the same tone he used when closing deals that moved markets. But this was different. This was personal, and the assistant glanced down at his screen, scanning quickly. They are still running a full breakdown, but it is not something typically found in standard beverage preparation. And that was enough, more than enough, because it meant one thing: this was not an accident, not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, and the weight of that realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, piece by piece, until it formed something solid, something unavoidable, and Daniel's gaze shifted, not to the assistant, not to the hallway, but back to Ava. And in that look there was no longer uncertainty, no longer questioning whether she had been right, because she had. And now the only question left was what came next, and Ava met his eyes without hesitation, her expression calm but not detached, because this was no longer just an observation. It was something real, something that had consequences beyond a single moment in a restaurant. "You should not go back there," she said quietly, not as advice, not as fear, but as fact, and Daniel nodded once, slow, deliberate, because he understood exactly what she meant, not just the physical place, but the situation, the environment, the assumptions he had walked into without question, and for the first time, the world he controlled so precisely felt just slightly unpredictable, not enough to unsettle him, but enough to demand a different kind of attention. "We need everything from that night," he said, turning slightly toward his assistant, his tone shifting again, sharper now, more directive. "Security footage, staff records, supplier logs, everything." And the assistant nodded immediately, already moving to carry out the instructions, leaving Daniel and Ava standing in a space that felt quieter now, more focused, like the noise of the hospital had pulled back just enough to let this moment breathe. And Ava exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction, not because the situation had improved, but because it had clarified, uncertainty replaced by truth, even if that truth carried more weight than she had wanted it to. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing simple left to say, until Daniel broke the silence, his voice lower now, not commanding, not distant, just direct. "You knew something was wrong before anyone else did." And Ava's gaze dropped briefly, then returned to his, steady, grounded. "I noticed," she said, correcting him again, not out of defiance, but because accuracy mattered. And Daniel almost nodded again, but stopped himself, because this was not something that required acknowledgement in the usual way. This was something that required understanding. And as he stood there, in a place where his name meant nothing, and the stakes felt more real than any boardroom he had ever walked into, he realized that the moment she stepped forward in that restaurant had not just changed the outcome of one night. It had changed the trajectory of something much larger, something that was still unfolding. And for the first time, he was not the one who had seen it coming. If they found compounds in the drink, then someone had access. Ava said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made the words feel heavier than they sounded. And Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because he was already several steps ahead, his mind moving through possibilities with the same precision he applied to every decision that mattered, narrowing variables, eliminating noise, isolating intent. And now intent was the only thing that made sense, because accidents did not leave patterns, and patterns were already forming, subtle but undeniable. "Access means proximity," he said finally, his tone measured, controlled, like he was building something piece by piece in real time. "Staff, suppliers, anyone who could get close without being noticed." And Ava nodded slightly, not because she was following his logic, but because she had arrived at a similar conclusion in her own way, through observation instead of analysis, through instinct shaped by experience instead of data. And for a moment they stood there, two completely different worlds intersecting over the same realization, neither superior, just aligned. And the sound of footsteps approached from down the hall, a nurse calling out a name that was not hers, not his, but still enough to pull Ava's attention for a brief second, her shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly before settling again. And Daniel noticed that too. The shift, the way her focus broke and returned, like there was something else anchoring her here beyond this conversation, something that mattered more than whatever was unfolding between them. And he followed her gaze for just a second before looking back at her. "You said your mother is here," he said, not as a question, but as a continuation, and Ava hesitated, just briefly, before nodding once. because there was no reason to deny it. Not now. Not after everything that had already been said. She is, she replied, her voice softer now, not weaker, just more grounded in something personal, something that existed outside of this situation entirely. And Daniel absorbed that, the context settling into place with everything else he had learned about her in the past hour, because it explained something he had not fully understood before, the urgency in her actions, the refusal to hesitate, the willingness to risk something already fragile. And for a moment he said nothing, because this was not a variable he could analyze the same way. This was something different, something that required a different kind of response. And as he stood there, the assistant returning with quiet updates about footage being secured and staff being contacted, Daniel realized that whatever this situation was, whatever it would become, it had already extended beyond him, beyond a single incident, beyond a single decision, because now it involved her, her reality, her circumstances, and that changed the balance in a way he was not used to calculating. You should not be dealing with this alone, he said finally, his voice lower now, not commanding, not distant, just direct. And Ava looked at him, really looked this time, not at the man people recognized, but at the one standing in front of her in a place where recognition meant nothing. And for a second something unreadable passed through her expression, not trust, not doubt, just consideration, because she understood what he was offering without him saying it outright. And she also understood what it could cost, not in money, not in opportunity, but in control, and control was something she had fought too hard to keep. I am not alone, she said quietly, and it was not defensive, not dismissive, just a statement of fact, because even in situations like this, she had learned to rely on herself first. And Daniel did not push back, did not argue, because he recognized that tone, that line, that boundary, and he respected it, not out of politeness, but because it was real, and real things required a different kind of approach. And as the conversation paused, the weight of everything that had been revealed settling into the space between them, Daniel understood something with a clarity he had not expected to find tonight, that whatever had started in that restaurant was no longer just a problem to solve. It was a connection, unexpected, unplanned, but undeniable, and it was already changing the way he moved forward. Whether he acknowledged it or not, pull the footage from the service corridor first, Daniel said, his voice low but decisive, cutting clean through the quiet updates his assistant had been giving. Because something about the way Ava had described the glass, the pressure, the uneven break, it did not align with the main dining area where everything was visible, where too many eyes made precision difficult, and his instincts, the ones that had built everything he owned, were now pointing somewhere less obvious, somewhere just outside the frame of what people usually paid attention to. And the assistant paused for a fraction of a second before nodding, already adjusting the request on his device, while Ava watched him, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with a kind of quiet recognition, because she understood what he was doing, not the mechanics, not the network of resources behind it, but the shift, the moment when uncertainty became direction, and she had felt that same shift earlier, just without the ability to act on it the way he could. Why the corridor? She asked. After a moment, her tone neutral but precise, not challenging, just seeking clarity, and Daniel glanced at her briefly before answering, his gaze steady, focused, because whoever did this would not risk being seen doing it directly. He said, the logic simple but grounded. They would prepare it somewhere out of view, then let the environment carry it the rest of the way. And Ava nodded slightly, her mind already mapping the layout she had worked in for months, the narrow hallway behind the kitchen, the small prep station where drinks were staged before being carried out, the place where things passed through hands without being watched too closely, and the image formed clearly, too clearly, enough to make her shoulders tighten just a fraction. There is a prep counter near the service door, she said quietly, adding to his thought without hesitation. It is not always monitored. And Daniel's eyes sharpened again, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because the picture was becoming clearer, each detail reinforcing the last, until it was no longer a theory, it was a direction, and directions led to answers. Get that footage now, he said, turning slightly toward his assistant. The urgency in his voice controlled but unmistakable, and the assistant moved quickly, stepping aside to make the call, leaving the two of them standing in a silence that felt heavier now, more defined, because the situation was no longer abstract. It was narrowing, focusing, becoming something they could almost see, and Ava exhaled slowly, her grip loosening on the empty cup she had been holding, her mind moving through the same space from a different angle. Not who, not why, but how, because. Understanding how meant understanding what to look for next, and she knew that space, knew the rhythm of it, the blind spots, the moments where attention dropped just enough for something small to slip through. If it happened there, she said after a moment, her voice steady. Then it was done quickly, during a shift change or a rush, and Daniel looked at her again, really looked, because she was not guessing, she was reconstructing, using what she knew to fill in gaps he had not even considered, and that mattered, more than he expected it to, because it meant he was not the only one building this picture. You remember the timing, he said, not as a question, but as recognition, and Ava nodded once, her expression focused. It was right before the dinner rush peaked, she replied. Around 7:15, maybe 7:20, and the specificity of it settled into the moment like another piece clicking into place, because now they had not just a location, but a time, a window, a point to examine. And Daniel felt the shift again, the movement from uncertainty to control, from reaction to strategy, and for a brief second, just one, he allowed himself to acknowledge something he had not expected to feel tonight. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something closer to respect, because the person standing in front of him, the one the world had overlooked, was the reason any of this was moving forward at all. And as his assistant returned, confirming that the footage was being pulled and analyzed immediately, Daniel's focus sharpened fully, the path ahead no longer unclear, because whatever had been set in motion against him was now being unraveled, piece by piece. And it had started with a moment most people would have ignored, but she had not. The update came in less than 10 minutes, faster than any of them expected, and that alone told Daniel everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken, because results like that did not come quickly unless something was already there, something obvious enough to surface without digging too deep. And when his assistant looked up from the phone this time, there was no hesitation, no careful phrasing, just clarity. "Sir, we have a match," he said, his voice controlled but edged with something sharper, something that carried consequence. And Daniel did not move, did not react outwardly, but his focus narrowed completely, locking onto the words before they even fully formed. "There is a staff member in the service corridor footage," the assistant continued, "not scheduled for that section, entering the prep area around 7:16, handling a glass, then leaving within 30 seconds. And silence followed again. But this time it was different, not uncertain, not searching, but resolved, because a pattern had just become a point, something specific, something actionable, and Ava felt it too. The shift from possibility to proof settling into the space around them, her breath slowing, her shoulders lowering just slightly, because this was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about what came next. "Who is it?" Daniel asked, his voice even, almost too calm, the kind of calm that did not come from ease, but from control, from knowing that once something was identified, it could be addressed. And the assistant glanced at the screen again, confirming before answering. "A junior staff member, recently hired, no prior incidents on record, but there is an anomaly." He paused briefly, scrolling. "They accessed the building through a service entrance earlier than their shift, and their badge activity does not match their assigned role tonight." And Daniel's jaw tightened just enough to register, because that was not coincidence. That was intent wrapped in subtlety, the kind that relied on people not paying attention to small details. And for a moment he said nothing, his mind already moving through the implications, the connections, the reasons someone would take that risk, because actions like that did not exist in isolation. They were part of something larger, something planned, something with purpose. And Ava watched him, the way he processed it, the way he did not rush to conclusions, did not react emotionally, but instead built the situation into something structured, something he could control. And she recognized that too, not the scale of it, but the discipline behind it. "They would not do this alone," she said quietly, her voice cutting into the moment, not to challenge, but to complete the thought. And Daniel looked at her, not surprised, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth in what she said, Because she was right. Someone at that level did not act without direction, without influence, without something driving them beyond their position. No, he replied, his tone firm now, grounded in certainty. They would not, and the words settled with weight, because now the situation had expanded again, from a single act to a network of intent, from one person to something unseen behind them, and the assistant shifted slightly, waiting for the next instruction, because there was always a next step with Daniel Whitmore, always a move that followed the last, and this time was no different. Do not confront them yet, Daniel said, his voice low but decisive. I want everything first: communication records, financial activity, connections, anything that explains why. And the assistant nodded immediately, already moving to execute, leaving Daniel and Ava standing in the same space, but in a completely different moment than before, because now the truth was no longer hidden. It was unfolding, and Ava exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting for just a second before returning to him, because this had gone further than she expected, further than she wanted, but she had stepped into it, and stepping back was no longer an option, and Daniel saw that too. The way she remained, the way she did not retreat even now, and for the first time, the thought crossed his mind not as a calculation, but as something quieter, more human, that she had already done more than anyone in that room, more than anyone in his world had done tonight, and she had done it without asking for anything in return, and that realization settled deeper than the situation itself, because it was not just about what had been uncovered, it was about who had uncovered it, and why that mattered more than he had expected. The next update did not come through the assistant. It came directly to Daniel's phone, a secure notification that bypassed the usual chain, and that alone was enough to shift his posture slightly, his attention narrowing as he read the message in silence, the glow of the screen reflecting briefly in his eyes before he locked it again. The information already processed, already integrated, and Ava watched him, not asking, not interrupting, because she understood that kind of moment, the kind where something changes quietly but completely. They traced a transfer, he said after a second, his voice lower now, more controlled than before. Small amount, routed through 3 accounts, but it leads to a holding group tied to one of our competitors, and the words settled into the space between them with a different kind of weight. Not immediate danger, but something more calculated, more deliberate, the kind of move that was meant to stay hidden, to look like nothing until it was too late, and Ava felt the implication before she fully processed it, her fingers tightening slightly against the cup in her hands before relaxing again, because this was no longer just about a single act in a restaurant. It was about intent at a level she had never been part of, never wanted to be part of, and Daniel saw that shift, the way her focus changed, the way the situation expanded beyond what she had stepped into. And for a moment he said nothing, because this was the point where most people would step back, where they would decide it was no longer their problem, no longer their place, and he would not have blamed her if she did, not now, not after everything that had already happened. You should go, he said finally, his voice even, not dismissive, not distant, just practical. This is not your responsibility. And Ava looked at him, really looked, not at the authority in his tone, but at the intention behind it, because she recognized it, not as control, but as protection, and that made her pause, just for a second longer than usual, because protection was not something she accepted easily, not when it came with conditions, not when it risked taking away the little control she had managed to keep. It became my responsibility when I noticed it, she said quietly, her voice steady, not defiant, just honest, and the words landed with a clarity that made Daniel's gaze hold hers for a fraction longer, because that was not logic, not strategy, that was something else entirely, something he did not encounter often, something that did not fit into the frameworks he was used to. And for a moment the noise of the hospital returned, footsteps, distant voices, the soft roll of a cart passing behind them, grounding the moment in something real, something immediate, and Ava's attention shifted again, pulled toward the hallway where a nurse had just called out a room number she recognized, her body reacting before her mind fully caught up, her shoulders straightening, her focus narrowing, because there were parts of her life that did not wait, did not pause for conversations like this. And Daniel followed her gaze, understanding without needing explanation, the context already there, the reason she was still here, The reason she had not left even when everything around her had changed, and something in him adjusted again, not in strategy, not in control, but in perspective, because this was not just about solving what had happened to him. It was about recognizing what had been revealed through it. Go, he said again, softer this time, not as an instruction, but as acknowledgement, and Ava hesitated for just a second before nodding, not because she was stepping away from the situation, but because she was choosing where she was needed most in this moment. And as she turned, her steps measured but certain, Daniel watched her go, not with uncertainty, not with doubt, but with a clarity he had not expected to find tonight. Because whatever this situation uncovered, whatever it led to next, one thing had already become undeniable, that she had changed the course of it without asking for anything in return, and that was not something he would forget. The hallway light was softer where Ava stopped, just outside the room she had been called to, her hand resting lightly on the door handle as she paused for a second, not because she was unsure, but because everything that had just happened was still settling somewhere beneath the surface, quiet but present, like a shift she could not fully name yet. And inside the room, the steady beep of a monitor filled the air, calm, consistent, grounding in a way nothing else had been tonight. And she stepped in without hesitation, her focus narrowing immediately, her movements gentle, precise, the same way they had been earlier, because this was where she belonged, not in conversations about power or strategy, but here, in moments that required presence more than anything else. And as she adjusted the blanket, checked the position of a hand, and spoke softly to someone who could barely respond, the world outside that room felt distant again, smaller, like something she had already chosen to leave behind. While down the hall, Daniel Whitmore stood exactly where she had left him, his assistant speaking quietly beside him, outlining next steps, legal options, security measures, all the things that usually followed a discovery like this, all the things that he understood better than anyone. And yet his attention was not fully there, not completely, because part of it remained fixed on the direction she had gone, on the way she had stepped away without hesitation, not asking for recognition, not waiting for a result, just moving toward what mattered most to her without looking back. And that was what stayed with him, more than the report, more than the confirmation, more than the strategy already unfolding, because it was not something he could replicate, not with resources, not with influence, not with anything he controlled. And for the first time in a long time, that difference mattered, not as a disadvantage, but as something he had not known he was missing. And the assistant paused mid-sentence, noticing the shift, waiting for direction, because there was always direction, always a next move. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting briefly before settling again, not on the hallway, not on the people moving through it, but somewhere quieter, more internal. Handle it, he said finally, his voice steady, composed, returning to what he knew, to what he did best. And the assistant nodded immediately, stepping away to execute, leaving Daniel alone in a space that felt different now, not empty, not quiet, just changed, because whatever had started tonight had already moved beyond the original problem, beyond the initial threat, into something less defined but more significant. And after a moment he turned, walking slowly down the hall, not toward the exit, not yet, but toward the room she had entered, stopping just short of the door, not crossing the line, not interrupting, just standing there for a second, watching through the narrow window as she moved with the same calm focus she had shown from the very beginning, the same steadiness, the same quiet strength that did not need recognition to exist. And he understood then, not as a conclusion, not as a statement, but as something simpler and more real, that she had not changed because of him. She had not stepped forward for him. She had simply been who she was, in a moment where it mattered, and that had changed everything, not just the outcome of one night, but the way he saw it, the way he understood it, the way he moved forward from it. And after a second longer, he stepped back, the light shifting slightly as he turned away, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor, leaving the moment exactly as it was, untouched, complete. In its own way, because some things did not need to be said to matter, and some changes did not need to be announced to last. And as the hallway returned to its steady rhythm, one thing remained clear, even in the silence, that she had not tried to change the world that night. She had simply chosen to do the right thing, and somehow, that had been enough.